today I want to talk about the legacy of Mass Effect Andromeda and how I think that is going to impact the next Mass Effect game and story and reputation and so on, and also kind of the future of BioWare a little bit with all of the other crazy stuff that's happening. So if you like Mass Effect, if you want video game news in general, reviews and speculation and all of that, maybe a video game podcast that comes out every week, please subscribe to this channel, like this video if you do, and leave a comment down below with what you think about the video, or just say hi. So to jump into it, with Mass Effect Andromeda, it's an interesting thing to get into because it's been talked to death already, right? I'm not going to go through every bit of development and everything that happened. The big points to hit on are, switching to Frostbite was a big deal for BioWare, going from Unreal Engine 3 that they used on the Mass Effect trilogy and their proprietary engine that they used on the Dragon Age games up to Inquisition, which was their first look or experience with Frostbite, which went pretty well. That game won Game of the Year for the Video Game Awards and was generally received well. I don't know how it's done long term. I'm not a huge Dragon Age fan, but it seems like it's still decently regarded, right? And then Andromeda happened, and we know that Frostbite move didn't go as well there. And we know that they switched animation engines or tools in the middle of development. And we know they were trying to do a procedural generation thing with planets. And we know that, at one point they were considering doing a First Contact War or a prequel game. And then they decided to do Andromeda and leave the Milky Way entirely, presumably to get away from having to deal with the end of Mass Effect 3, only a few years after all of that controversy and after all of the issues that came along with that when it came to developers being harassed and probably being burned out and so on and so forth. So Andromeda gets developed. It seems like, and I remember there being a general air of excitement. People were excited to see what BioWare was going to do with the franchise in a modern engine and on more modern consoles. And then it came out. And you had the bugs, and you had the animations, and you had the protagonists that not everyone loved after having Super Serious Shepherd. And now we have CW, sarcastic, silly boy or silly girl Ryder. And it's really interesting because in hindsight, Andromeda is a fine game. It's okay. I personally don't love it. I don't even know if I like it. But if you just look at it as an action game, a sci-fi space action game, it's fine. It's perfectly adequate. The issue is that you put the weight of the Mass Effect franchise on it, and it just kind of doesn't hold up. And you can tell that for a lot of people, that's the issue. It's not necessarily whether the Angarans look like weird cats or if the story itself is just like fine, if much of the game are like weird fetch quests and like kind of time wasting things. It's just that in a lot of ways the game just doesn't fulfill that feeling of Mass Effect and things that people expected, right? And I would say that's even true to this day to a point. Now, you can argue that Andromeda never really got a chance. It, had this rough release. They fixed it up okay. And then they moved on to Anthem. And, there were plans and thoughts of a DLC, if not more than one DLC for Andromeda. The end of the game, spoilers, basically tells you, oh, now we're going to explore the Quarian arc. We're getting, some kind of messages or some kind of hails or SOSs from one of the arcs that we obviously never see in the game because it got lost, and that's a whole different story. But we never see a single Quarian or many of the species from the Milky Way in Andromeda, because supposedly, it was because their arc got lost or damaged, or if you read the book, that there's a longer story behind that. But Regardless, it never happened. They kind of half fixed the game up. If you play it today, it still is rife with bugs and issues and weird things. It's not fixed entirely, but it's playable. And they moved on to Anthem. And in hindsight, what's kind of funny is that for all intents and purposes, it looks like Andromeda was moderately financially successful. It seemed like it probably at least repaid for itself, and probably made EA a little bit of money. And then they moved on to Anthem, which, if Andromeda was bad enough, Anthem was even worse, right? Because it was one of their first forays into the games as a service. It had so much promise. It had so many exciting, the teasers and the gameplay and everything they showed for that game were amazing, only to find out later that like the main teaser everyone saw was a vertical slice of the game that was only made to be shown and was never really intended to represent the game. Without getting into Anthem too much, it makes me think back to like, what if they didn't do that? What if they wouldn't have abandoned Andromeda for Anthem? What if they would have released this Korean Arc DLC? What if they would have made another Andromeda game? The game seems like it was intended to likely be another trilogy, like the OG trilogy, and that's not what happened. And that's never going to happen. I do believe we return to Andromeda one day, but it's probably not going to be as a direct sequel to Andromeda. Regardless of all of that, the game has had a redemption arc. People generally seem to like the game. You can find people who it's their favorite Mass Effect game. There's people still playing it today. I've even dabbled in it, in the last couple of years. And so what's interesting is that while I think many of the big issues of Andromeda remain, it worked its way back, at least in a lot of ways. But the damage was kind of done. And BioWare, in my opinion, in my estimation, in my viewpoint, has never quite recovered. And we can talk a little bit about that. So since the time of Andromeda's release, probably the biggest event was Casey Hudson leaving. And then coming back for a minute, and then leaving again subsequently to start his own studio called Humanoid Studios. A big issue with that is that he took much of the BioWare staff with him. If you ever take a look at their staffing, either on LinkedIn or on their own website, you'll notice that you'll recognize a lot of names. If you look on their Twitter bios, many of them are former BioWare, who have been hired as recently as the last year or so. One tidbit about that I've always found interesting is that Hudson left and then came back for a year and a half or so, and then left again. And I've always thought that time he came back was probably to help them set the future of maybe all of their franchises, but especially Mass Effect, to kind of come back, be that reference again. Obviously he has valuable input from being, from the original game and having obviously a lot to do with that. And then, he went off and he's doing Humanoid, and we're going to see what happens with that. There's been good news with BioWare since then. We had Mary DeMarley get picked up and be made the lead narrative director for the next Mass Effect game. You would know her from some of the recent Deus Ex games. For me personally, from the Guardians of the Galaxy game, which came out a couple years ago and was just fantastic. It was just such a good game. It was marred by the Marvel Avengers games as a service game, and the Guardians of the Galaxy didn't have very good trailers. So people kind of dismissed it before it came out, and then it came out, and it was one of my favorite games that year and one of my favorite games ever. It has a wonderful, really fantastic story, and the characters are written well, and the story is really fun and it's written well. And that should lead people to be pretty excited, I think, about the next Mass Effect, especially as opposed to Andromeda. I don't think we're going to be looking at another CW type of game, trying to go for a much younger audience. I think we're going to get a more mature, but still, self-referencing and maybe not taking itself too seriously type game, being led up by Mary DeMarley. And then obviously in most recent history, we've had the issues with layoffs. Earlier this year, 50 people were laid off from BioWare. They were mostly working on Dreadwolf, it sounds like, almost exclusively, it seems. And they were a lot of narrative people, as well as some tech people. And then now there's a subsequent lawsuit that those people who were laid off, 7 of them, are suing to get better severance packages. Not a great look. Only kind of compounds the issues with BioWare, because when people think BioWare, what people are thinking mostly right now are these recent stories of layoffs and suits. They think of Anthem, which was a game with potential, but a games as a service that never really got off the ground. And then they think of Andromeda, which was a Mass Effect game that, especially in the time since, has been, its reputation has been a little bit rectified, but is still considered in general a letdown for the franchise. And now we have this, what you could consider boondoggle of Dragon Age Dreadwolf, which is a game that's been in development for a really long time, has supposedly been rebooted multiple times, has had huge changes in its focus and whether it was going to be multiplayer or co-op or be like a games as a service or not. And now we've settled on that. It's just going to be a single player story game, which is great, but it's still being internally delayed and we still haven't seen much from it. So that leads us to Mass Effect 4, or the next Mass Effect, and how I think the specter or the memory of Andromeda will kind of affect it moving forward. We have reason to believe that Andromeda is going to directly influence this next game. Michael Gamble, who's the lead on the next game, has vaguely, but pretty assuredly made it clear that Andromeda will be involved in some capacity in this next game. That's made especially interesting by, as far as we can tell, all of the teasers for the next game looking like it's going to be set in the Milky Way. So we have to get kind of creative with how Andromeda is going to affect that. Now, back in 2020, when they released the Mass Effect Will Continue trailer, Andromeda is shown. In the beginning of the trailer, you see the Andromeda Galaxy off in the distance. You see the Milky Way much more prominently shown in the bulk of the screen. Then the camera dives into the Milky Way and we get the rest of that trailer. That trailer includes mention of Arc 6. Now, there's a little bit of debate about this, and I'm still kind of on the fence. It seems like Arc 6 is a reference to the Quarian arc, where there were 5 arcs, and then the Nexus, which is like the home ship or the home base. But it seems like people generally accept that the Nexus was the first arc, and then the other 5 arcs were the live ships that the various species actually traveled to Andromeda on, or in the case of the Quarian arc, attempted. Like I said before, we know that arc didn't make it necessarily, and its mention in the 2020 trailer for the next Mass Effect game is curious, and it tends to lead more credence to the idea that Andromeda will be involved from a story perspective in the next game. Now in 2022, we had another N7 day where they showed off a bunch of concept art and a little video. The video really didn't hint anything to Andromeda, in my opinion, besides some of the ships in that video kind of looking a little bit like the arcs, but like a real small version of them. But what was interesting is in some of the concept art, people noticed of a city that looks like a Asari city. You see a bunch of store brands and logos all over the concept art that match what you saw in Andromeda. Now, some people have taken that to say, oh, this must be in Andromeda. They've settled and made these big cities in Andromeda. I would throw out that everything that was in Andromeda came from the Milky Way. So it's more likely that these are just corporate, basically sponsors that sent their logos and their brands and everything to Andromeda. And that's why they show up there. We're going to see them again in the Milky Way. That's my explanation. We'll have to see who's right. But it's still a reference to Andromeda. One of the big issues with Andromeda is that, at least in some capacity, they're going to have to do at least a little bit of retconning. The simple fact is that a operation as large as the Initiative to go to Andromeda, this mysterious benefactor who was able to pay for all of this stuff and organize it, all of the desertions they essentially had from the various species militaries and governments to go be on this initiative, it would have been on people's radars. I've seen people argue that this was just a little operation that no one would have talked about. That's why Shepard would have never talked about it, and why Liara would have never mentioned it, despite being the shadow broker, or at least an information broker. None of that checks out to me. It simply just doesn't make any sense to me that they wouldn't at least be aware of what's going on, because this is one of the biggest operations that's ever happened in the galaxy. You know, this giant Nexus ship, these arcs that they're sending off, all of these important people from the various species on these arcs leaving the galaxy to go explore and set up trade routes, but with the undertones of at least the thought that this was to get away from the impending Reaper War, which Shepard knew about and their crew know about, and that various people in the governments knew about, but was mostly being ignored or rejected by the majority of people. I think that they're going to have to figure out some way to explain why the Andromeda Initiative is never mentioned in the trilogy. Now, the real reason is because they hadn't thought of it yet. It didn't exist when they were making those games, but the story is going to have to be different. A big part of that is that from the opening of Andromeda, you'll find that it seems that at least some of the arcs were being built and or staged by the moon near Earth. So you can't tell me that, as someone mentioned at one point, like, oh, they were trying to keep it hush hush. No, they weren't. They literally were staging these giant arcs directly beside Earth. Like, it would have been in sight of everyone who was coming and going from the planet. So my concern with that is that I don't like that, because of what they did with Andromeda, setting it in the future, that no matter what they do with the franchise, whenever this next game takes place, it's all going to have to take Andromeda into account, because it's out there and it exists. And I think it's a bummer that a game that, in my opinion, is as weak as Andromeda is kind of gonna set the stage and set the tone for the franchise moving forward in some capacity, is kind of a bummer. But I hope they'll make it work. So I guess, kind of in conclusion, I want to try to wrap this up without going on too long. I don't necessarily think that Andromeda isn't all a bad thing. I bet they've learned a lot of lessons. They've at least learned enough to know to get away from Frostbite. They've at least, learned enough to, do this multi-year, hype campaign for a game that's still in pre-production. I suspect they're going to learn a lot from, gameplay and storytelling and things like that. I suspect we'll see a lot of influence from Andromeda in the next game when it comes to combat and relationships, and the way they set up hubs and missions. And if the rumors are that they're getting rid of the open world, that's a pretty big influence as well, because that was a big part of Andromeda. And what I will say is that even though I don't like Andromeda that much, I think that the lessons they learned from that, the fact that Anthem failed, which is probably a good thing, or else they would have spent all their time on Anthem for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. I really hope that this is a studio that, especially after Dreadwolf, is going to be ready to not get back to their roots, but establish a new reputation for themselves with some great leadership, some OGs that have been there forever, as well as new people, and that this next Mass Effect game can be the beginning, another beginning for the franchise, and that hopefully we won't have to wait 10 plus years to get an entry that we all really wanted again. So that's my take on it. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button if you did, comment down below with what you think, how you feel about Andromeda, what you're thinking about for the next game. I'm the eternal optimist. I think it's coming. I think we're going to be fine, even through their rough patch right now. And I'm excited about N7 Day. So tell me what you think we're going to find out on N7 Day. That's a good one. I am Bon Diesel all over the place, on all social media, including over on Twitch, where I stream a few times a week. You can catch my weekly gaming podcast called The Bonfire right here on this YouTube channel, or on all podcast providers. That's all I have for this one. So until next time.